You're listening to We Are STS, a podcast from the Department of Science and Technology Studies at University College London. Hi, everybody, and welcome back to We Are STS. I'm your host, Professor Joe Kane. This is Episode 7. As researching academics, we produce a lot of publications. That includes books, papers, reports, and more. Sometimes our work stays in small communities of specialists. Other times, it travels far and wide. Once in a while, a project even wins awards. Of course, winning an award is a great honor. It also gives us an excuse to move a piece into the spotlight and to sing the praises of it and its authors. Today, we have an example. Last year, Professor Simon Werrett won the Paul Bunge Prize from the German Chemical Society. That's chemists giving an award for a work of history. Now that's a big deal. So I got out the spotlight and put in a call to Professor Werrett so we could talk about the book that won this award and about its main ideas. While he was on the line, I asked him about his background, how did he get interested in history of science, and what's that career path that saw him transform from an art school student into a professor of history working on recycling in Restoration England, and everything from the history of chemistry, kitchen sieves, to printing blocks. Now in this chat, Simon catches me out on a huge bias I have as a historian of documents. Simon just takes it in his stride and pretends he didn't even notice. See if you can spot my mistake. I start by asking Simon to introduce himself.
So my name's Simon Werrett, and I teach history of science in the Department of Science and Technology Studies at UCL. And I've been in the department for about 10 years, came in 2012. And before that, I was an associate professor at the University of Washington in their history department. And I was there for about 10 years. My background is in art, in history of science, and in Russian. And I think all my work kind of revolves around those three areas.
You threw together three different ideas there. So can you say how those three ideas come together to build your sense of expertise?
Yeah, so I have quite an odd path into history of science, which I think is fairly typical for most historians of science. So I started out when I was at school. I was quite clear that the thing I wanted to do was to do fine art, to do painting and sculpture. I went to art school to do that. I spent a year doing a foundation course, is what you do if you want to do an art degree. And it was great fun and really interesting, but I didn't have the best portfolio at the end of it, shall we say, and kind of changed my ideas. And ended up going to university. The other thing I'd been interested in before I went to art college was science, and particularly astronomy and physics. And I hadn't been able to do those at school because in my school in those days, you could either do sciences or arts, but you couldn't do both. So when I got to university, what I found is that, university is a wonderful thing and you can do pretty much anything you want, academically speaking. So I ended up doing history of science because it was a way to sort of do science without being a scientist. And it's something I've been interested in as a teenager. And so I absolutely loved it. And I'm still doing it now, many years later. The other thing that happened at that time was I chose to do my degree in 1989, 1990. And that was the time when the Soviet Union fell apart. And that was an incredibly exciting thing to watch happening and to live through. And it made me so very optimistic about being involved with the former Soviet Union, people in the former Soviet Union. And so I decided I would learn Russian for my degree, as well as all the other things. So that's what I did. And I did Russian and history of science. They had to kind of design a special degree for me because people, that wasn't available per se. And then when I did my PhD, I combined those things. So I've always been interested in Russia, in history of science. And because I had that art background, that's made me very interested in practice and craft and different kinds of material things and what you can do with them. So most of my work interweaves those three elements.
So there's something very special coming out of your early interest in art that feeds into your interest in history of science. And it sounds like what you're saying is there's a tactile kind of relationship between the art that you were interested in and the science that you're studying now. Is that about right?
That's right. And I mean, weirdly, I never think of myself as a historian or a writer even. I did art and then I kind of added those on at the end. So I always think very much in kind of practical terms, I suppose. And I think that's been good for me because it's given me kind of perspectives that I might not have had if I'd had a more, I suppose, traditional kind of text-focused academic background.
You're one of the few people, Simon, that I know that say in the kind of sterile atmosphere of a research seminar where people are sitting in a university classroom and someone's talking about Renaissance science and going on and on and on. And you're one of the few people I know who will ask a question like, what's the paint made out of? Or where did they get the mercury that they were working with? And I myself, I trace that back to this biography of yours where you're talking about an early history working with materials. Do you see that connection too, or would you trace a different path?
No, definitely. So it's always the kind of practice is the thing that in a way comes naturally to me. And the questions around practice about how do you actually kind of make this thing? What do you need to do in order for it to appear on the table? You know, those are questions that I've always asked well before I did history of science. So it's very fortuitous for me, I suppose, that historians of science have come around more and more to thinking about science as a practice and a form of material culture in recent years. Then that kind of falls naturally to me. Seems to make sense to ask the kinds of questions that involves, because those are things that I think always were at the beginning of any project that I was doing when I was doing art, and I still am. I mean, that's the thing. I still think of it as. I mean, it's not art; it's writing and research, but it still feels like a kind of creative process of making something when I'm writing. To me, it doesn't feel like there's a very strong division between one and the other. It's just different media.
Simon, I wanted to talk to you today because I wanted to talk about your recent book, Thrifty Science. And this picks up some of the themes that you've been saying. So Thrifty Science book came out in 2019. Can you say a little bit about what the main theme is of that book? And then we can talk about some of the big ideas that are inside of it.
So Thrifty Science is a book about material culture, and it's about experimentation and the history of experimentation and where does experiment as a method in science come from. And it's also a book which is about using the history of science to think about environmental history and environmental issues that we face today. That was incredibly important to me in doing the work on this book, and I hope it's going to be a contribution to thinking about that. So the basic idea was to look at the household as a place where experimental inquiry was happening in the period of what's used to be called the scientific revolution, so the 17th, 18th centuries. And the thing I'm really interested in is how living at home, domestic life, was actually a motivation for experimenting in that period. And the book is the story of how people lived and how they organised their domestic life in the 17th and 18th centuries, and how that led them into a particular kind of experimentation with the material things that they had around them. So a lot of the book is about everyday stuff, pots and pans and teacups and colanders and sieves and things like that you have around at home. And it's about how certain values associated with the household led people to experiment with those things. And some of those experiments ended up in places like the Royal Society, where they were turned into publications and what we now see as scientific knowledge. And I think that the root, the kind of domestic origins of that knowledge and the values that led it to be generated have been obscured over time, so that the book is trying to kind of bring that back and recover it.
That's one of those big ideas that kind of sneaks through this book. If you're not paying very close attention, I think when you're thinking about what is Simon up to in this book, I think it's easy to miss that and to kind of obsess on that word thrift and to think about thriftiness, I suppose, in the sense that you mean it, of recycling and reusing and repurposing things. But what you're saying is something really different, which is, yes, the book is about that, is if you follow how people actually worked, you find that they're reusing and repurposing all this stuff
stuff. But what you just said, it sounds like there's another big idea here. It's where the work gets done, that a lot of this is done in the home long before it ends up getting transferred to places of what people who are used to science today think about as where science gets done, right?
Yeah, exactly. And of course, the key word is thrift. So household management, how you organise your home in the early modern period. And the book is about England. So I kept it fairly restricted to England just so I could get into some depth on this. So I'm talking about other areas now, researching other areas now. But in early modern England, if you wanted to read about how to organise your home effectively, you would buy a book of economy with an O. And economy means basically household management. And what I propose in the book is that one of the values that economy promotes is thrift. And thrift is not the same, it doesn't mean the same thing as it does today. So today, if you talk about thrift, you'd probably be thinking of someone being careful with their money. They don't want to spend too much money. In the early modern period, it can be used to mean that, but usually it's used to mean finding a balance between spending money and saving it, or spending money buying new things and making use of what you already have. And we have a lot of history of one side of that equation, which is buying new stuff. So there's lots of histories of consumption in the early modern period, but we don't have histories of making use of what you already have. So the whole book is really about that. It's about the fact that one of the kind of imperatives of domestic life in early modern England was to find out new uses for things that you already own. And that is what leads people to experiment, because experimentation basically is looking at what are the capacities of different materials and objects and what can they do. So the household is a really experimental place because it's thrifty. And the book is a kind of catalogue of all the different ways in which people then pick up mice and beer glasses and furniture, fireplaces, all the things around them, and then you experiment with them to make use of them, to find out what you can do with them that you're not already. And there's a thrifty imperative to that. And it ultimately goes back to God. So the idea is that all these material things around you are a gift of God, and therefore it's up to you to make the most of them, to use them well. And experimenting, I'm arguing, is the result of that imperative. And then little bits of it get picked up as and turned into experimental philosophy. And
right.
That's
and
the
so
bit
that's
that we know. Yeah.
So the idea of experimenting with use and repurposing, experimenting, exploring, trying it out, that's not just about science. Science is a subset of a much broader kind of virtuous activity of making use of things and seeing what works and what doesn't. That's the main point there, isn't it?
Exactly. And so science is something that men in university colleges do in the 17th and 18th century for the most part. And they're a little tiny subset of this much bigger experimental culture. Because that way of doing things is a very productive, creative, ingenious, useful practice. What they try to do is to kind of appropriate that way of knowing into science, which up until that point was basically very scholastic. It's about reading and commenting on text. So they take things like magic, from the artisanal workshop, and then also from the home. And they take them to new institutions where they try to represent that practical work in scholarly terms. So make a load of references to ancient authors when you're discussing how to bake a cake, and you come up with something like what the experimental philosophy looks like. You get a group of well-to-do men to sanction the knowledge, put it in a publication, and that becomes experimental science.
I could well imagine a situation where, going back to paint making, color making, where a kitchen environment where people are exploring how to make different kinds of colors and how to make them last in certain ways. You strike good on a couple of, say, incredibly bright yellows, and then I take that into the Royal Society and say, look, everybody, look what I discovered, and off we go, right?
Yeah, and the key thing, I suppose, well, there's two valuable things that come out of that thought, I suppose. One of them is that if you realize that experimenting and science are not the same thing in the early modern period, that experimenting is a much bigger phenomenon, then that opens up all kinds of communities for you to look at as a historian that you wouldn't if you think that experiment and science are synonymous. The scholar who's taking the paint recipe into the Royal Society, in our supposed case, probably got it from his wife.
Right.
He may have got it from one of the servants. It could have been, his aunt who came up with that recipe. But by the time it arrives in the philosophical transactions, it's presented as his discovery, if you like. So there are these families are really kind of knowledge-making units in the 17th, 18th centuries. And by family, one means a kind of extended family with servants and relatives and friends even kind of included in that. And it's a kind of communal family enterprise. And only one aspect of that kind of makes it into the authorized knowledge environment that is science. So it opens up those interesting communities to look at. The other thing about it is that, and this is where we get to the environmental question, is that when you actually look at how people managed their material culture and the way they thought about it, from our perspective, it looks very, very green. So they are very, very careful to make the most of materials. And so they have all kinds of practices that to us look like recycling and repurposing and reuse. To them are actually more like a form of worship because they're making the most of what God has given them. So they don't have an environmental discourse around what they're doing, but all the practices look incredibly good to us if we're trying to think about how to be more careful, more sustainable in terms of how we manage material culture ourselves.
And this is one of the hardest things to get our heads around nowadays, where we can basically buy anything we want to off the internet. We can basically get it delivered tomorrow. Certainly in Britain, that's true. And the idea that reusing and repurposing has a value to it, it is something I think you rightfully say is lost in some places in the culture.
The reason you can get everything delivered tomorrow today is our modern culture of capitalism was really invented as the kind of mirror image of the thrifty culture that preceded it. So in the early 19th century, I think there's a quite conscious effort to reinvent science and other practices in a way that's as far from that kind of thrifty domestic make use culture as it can be. And so you get a completely different outlook on material things, which says they should be mass manufactured, they should be disposable, they should be cheap, they don't need to last a long time. And that's generated the kind of current paradigm of material culture that we live in, which is causing all these environmental problems. So by looking back to the 17th and 18th centuries and the kind of approach to materials that preceded that, I argue in the book that, there are lessons there for how we can take forward our sustainability today, because recycling and repurposing and reuse are fine, but they're actually quite a limited step compared to what early moderns were doing, because they really had a whole mindset and way of approaching material culture that meant that they were very careful with what they had.
It really is unbelievable to be near a science lab and just to watch the volume of material that goes in every day, and then to see the waste bins outside of the labs fill up every morning as they have overnight cleaning. And the scale of use of material is amazing.
Yeah, exactly. So in the early 19th century, there's a move to change what a scientific instrument is. In the 17th and 18th century, I argue anything can be a scientific instrument. All you have to do is to take some object and think of a way to use it to learn something about nature. So the apparatus that get mentioned in scientific papers throughout that period have all sorts of things, feathers and bowls and plates and just stuff that you have around the house. And then in the early 19th century, I think you get more and more of a move towards saying, well, a scientific instrument has to be something that's designed to do science, and it can't do anything else. And in the 19th century, the idea that something does one thing very well becomes a key feature of material culture in England at any rate. So instead of having something that can be adapted to lots of different uses, which is what would be valuable in the 17th century, you have one thing that does one thing very well. The good news is that those things do things very well, but the bad news is that once they stop doing them, they become waste. You can't do anything else with them. Whereas the things from the early modern period are designed to be adaptable and reusable in different ways. So if it stops being, if you can't use a quill to write anymore, you can use the feather to put in a mattress, say. But if you have a biro and it stops working, you just throw it away. And that's the contrast that I think then leads to that huge proliferation of specialised instruments in the 19th century, and then this mass manufacture which causes all these problems of waste.
Is that transition caused by science?
Well, I think it's a lot of things. I mean, it's also obviously an industrial revolution change. It's a transition to larger scale production in the early 19th century. I think it's a lot to do with distinction. So I think it's also a moment when Europeans are trying to distinguish themselves from other people in other parts of the world. And one of the ways they do that is by claiming to have a material culture which is superior to their own past and to the present of people around the world. So what you see, in fact, is in the 19th century, one of the ways that, say, anthropologists talk about what they would call primitive material culture. So in other words, from other parts of the world, they say, well, the reason it's primitive is because it doesn't have a specialized function. They just have a knife, and they use the knife to do all kinds of different things. And they haven't figured out that you can have special tools to do special projects. So that becomes the way that they talk about sort of non-Europeans. And it's also the way they talk about their own past, that people in the past didn't have proper scientific equipment because it was all made up of household items. And I think they reinvented what this early modern thrifty science as a kind of immature version of their own professional specialized science. And that's still very much how that gets looked at today. And I think we need to kind of get past that, because actually, in many ways, the earlier way of dealing with material culture and that non-European way of dealing with material culture is more progressive for our current needs than the Victorian kind of modern science version.
That's a great example of that colonial epistemology, kind of setting the rules such that you automatically find yourself at the very top of the list and everybody else is below you. But it's only because you set the rules. You set the rules according to the criteria that put you at the top, right?
Yeah, exactly.
One of the things that we slipped through very quickly in this discussion was who's doing the work and where the work is getting done. Now, where the work is getting done, you're saying, is often in the home. And who's doing the work? In your book, you talk about science being not the exclusive domain of older gentlemen, but certainly being a family activity, being an activity for women and children, being an activity for all kinds of people who live in the domestic sphere. Can you say more about that and how that ties into the broad theme of your book?
Absolutely. One of the most exciting things that happened in history of science recently, which I was very inspired by, was a new focus on what women were doing in the domestic sphere in terms of making and experimenting with food and with medicine. Someone like our colleague Elaine Leon in the history department has done extremely interesting work in this area. And what Elaine and other people have argued is that women were very productive, creative, experimenters in the home in the 17th and 18th centuries. And they were constantly making new medicines. And most medicine that they used, looking after the family, was actually made by them at home. And they exchanged recipes in order to do that. And they were constantly trying new things out. They had distilling apparatus. It was quite common to have that in your house. And then you would use that to make essences and oils. And they would make poultices and plasters and all kinds of things. I read that literature, and that's really the thing that got me interested in the home. And then I thought that there's another story which goes back to people like Deborah Harkness and Stephen Shapin, that most experimenting of the more traditional kind that we associate with the scientific revolution, so people like Robert Boyle and Isaac Newton, most experimenting happened in the home. There's a famous paper by Shapin called The House of Experiment, which makes that argument. So in a way, my goal was simply to say, well, is there a common culture which is producing both of these practices? The kinds of experiments we associate with women making medicine and the kinds of experiments that people like Robert Boyle and Isaac Newton are doing. So the book is sort of an attempt to weld those two things together and see what is the world from which both of those traditions emerge. So, and then my argument is that thrift is the thing that kind of binds them together. But what it does mean is that actually they aren't really two separate worlds. I mean, they are all people, men, women, husbands, wives, children, relatives, servants, who occupy households and do experiments. And they often collaborate and work on them together. There's lots of examples of that. So we need to kind of recognize that, I think, because it's what precedes what ends up as knowledge that looks like it's all done by men. But in fact, that's the end point of a process which is much more involving of the family.
It feels like if the only thing we know is what's been published in the philosophical transactions of the Royal Society, we only know about 10% of the story. That's what I take as a big message from your book.
That's right. That's right. There are little hints. I mean, it's interesting because if you read something like the Philosophical Transactions, they mention household items all the time. But people have always talked about that, if to the degree that they have, they've sort of taken the attitude, well, they sort of made use of what they had. But obviously, if they'd had proper scientific instruments, they would have used those. Whereas what I'm trying to say is it wasn't that they couldn't have better scientific instruments. Someone like Robert Boyle is the wealthiest guy in Britain. He could make anything he wanted to. But they chose to make use of these things because that was part of this thrifty attitude. And similarly, there are little hints about people, about wives and daughters who are occasionally mentioned but never named. Once you start to kind of look for it, you really see that it's there, but most of it is pretty obscured.
Now, I want to ask you one more big idea in the book, and that's about life cycles of things. And I want to ask you, if when you were exploring the idea of the life cycle of objects, did anything come out as a particularly meaning-filled example for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think there's lots of things. One of them would be playing cards. In the 17th, 18th century, playing cards are only printed on one side. And so people use the other side for all sorts of things. So, for example, John Evelyn drew a design for an alchemical furnace on the back of a playing card. Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote a book called, I think, The Travels of the Solitary Walker, entirely on the back of playing cards. And people announced their lectures using playing cards. So they would write the details of when the lecture was going to happen at a university on the back of a playing card, and then they would put their seal on it to show that it was the genuine thing. You weren't going to show up and there wouldn't be anyone there. And then they would distribute them to the students so they knew when to go. And an amazing object, which I came across in that regard, it's in the British Library, and it's Edward Gibbon's card catalogue of his library. When you and I were doing our PhDs, if you went to the library, you used a card catalogue to find books. And the reason that they are cards and they're the size that they are is because originally they were playing cards. So Edward Gibbon, who basically has one of the first card catalogues, used old playing cards, and he would write the details of the book in pen with a quill on the back of the card, and then he would file it away. And if you go to ephemera fairs and kind of antique markets these days, you can occasionally pick those up because lots of people use them for cataloguing their libraries. So playing cards are actually really kind of a fascinating story just in and of themselves. And they're just one example of hundreds of different kinds of objects that got reused in that way. And then, of course, if they were really bashed up and useless, then you would send them off to be pulped down, and then they might be reused for various things, to make cardboard, for example.
It seems like the cycle just keeps turning and turning in some of those cases.
It does, until the 19th century, when everybody produces specialised goods that you can't do very much with afterwards, and then they ended up in landfill, or they were incinerated and produced all kinds of unpleasant, toxic byproducts. You know, again, one of the things that's interesting about the early modern period is that people don't have many possessions and they don't have many different kinds of material, but the limited number that they did have, they gave lots of different uses to. One of the things I say in the book is if you look at paintings of early modern interiors, they always look a bit sparse, they look a bit empty, but actually they're full because they've got a few objects that have many, many uses. Whereas in a modern interior, we have lots and lots of objects that have one use. Our interiors look very full up of stuff, but they're no more full than the early modern interiors.
That's given me a game for the kids where if you need 10 minutes of kid activity, sort of open up any image and you start asking them, what do you spot that's been reused? I used exactly your example in the book. I just showed it to some kids and said, now look, see how many things can you pick out that probably got reused from somewhere else? And they love it. They start picking it out. And of course, then they turn around in the world around them and they start thinking, well, I could use this for a hat and I can use this for a shoe and I can use this for a spoon. And you get them on that attitude, and you think, yeah, that's it. You're thinking like they did. That's down to you, Simon. It's the wisdom of the academic transferred to kids.
Well, that's the thing. It's playful. Ultimately, you know, people wouldn't have done it if it was an enormous chore. And I think thinking that way, that the home is a very creative, playful, interesting place. And I think one of the effects of the switch to the kind of industrial culture is that it represents the home as simply a place where you consume the stuff that other people have invented. It sort of takes away that agency, that inventiveness, or rather, people do still do that. The fact that they do it kind of loses its bigger value, because inventiveness comes to be seen as something that happens in kind of R&D departments and laboratories that other people, professionals, do.
It must be exhausting for you to go around when you're in that mood where you're starting to ask exactly those questions. Where does that come from? Where did that come from? And it must be exhausting for you where you start talking that way, because you can end up getting stuck in a room and never wanting to leave.
Yesterday, I spent a couple of hours looking at the history of sieves, because there was an 18th century natural philosopher called Stephen Hales, and he invented an apparatus to breathe in a room full of noxious vapours. And it basically involved putting a piece of flannel over a sieve, putting the sieve inside a bladder, and then breathing through the bladder using a peg taken from a cider barrel. So it's a good example of thrifty science. But it got me thinking, well, what did people use sieves for in the early modern period, and what do they use bladders for? Where do they get bladders? I mean, that's the question you were saying I ask a lot. So I then proceeded to sort of get lost in the world of sieves and bladders for a couple of hours. But it's absolutely fascinating, because when you have amazing resources like we do now, where you can go and full text search, all the publications from the 17th and 18th century, you can find all the little different uses that people put these things to. And it's incredible that the kind of variety and the richness of the different ways that they use them. This is another point of thrifty science, which is to say you don't need to own the world in order to learn about stuff. You can make do with a few things that are just around you.
So, Simon, the last thing I wanted to say was that you've been awarded the Paul Bunge Prize from the German Chemical Society and the German Society for Physical Chemistry. First of all, congratulations.
Thank you very much.
Did they give you any indication for why they awarded you this prize?
They didn't. That's mainly because I haven't really had a chance to interact with them yet, because the lockdown and the pandemic have been delaying the chance for us to have an award ceremony a number of times. So I'm very much looking forward to talking to them. I think the general interest in the book and in the work seems to be that it's quite a different way of thinking about scientific instruments, because traditionally, the history of scientific instruments has been about instruments, where we know what the instrument is, and it's something that's seen as designed to do science. And I suppose my argument is that that's only one way of having scientific instruments, and it's actually something that developed in the 19th century. And before that, anything could be a scientific instrument. And I think that's what they like.
I bet that in the conversations you're going to have at the awards ceremony, I bet you're going to hear a lot of stories about repurposing and reuse and thriftiness within laboratories. You must hear those on a regular basis.
I do. And this is the reason I say thrifty science has never gone away, but it's sort of been demoted. In the science studies literature, it's basically tacit knowledge. It's all the little kind of hacks and things that only the people who got the apparatus working know how to do, which then causes problems for replication in other laboratories. The famous one in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is where they're describing the apparatus that you need to create this very special drive that can allow you to kind of travel around the universe at sort of hyper speeds. And the key thing to get it to work is that you dip some electrodes in a nice hot cup of tea. And so that's a perfect example of thrifty science. And it's also the kind of tacit knowledge thing that, only the people who did it would know that that's what you need. So it's there all the time. But as Harry Collins and tacit knowledge studies tell us, it's become something which isn't spoken about, because it's not seen as the proper kind of publishable version of science. It's only when everything is kind of finalized and produced in a professional, proper way that it becomes something to be discussed.
So, Simon, you published this book in 2019, great reviews. You've been doing a lot of work since the publication of that book. Can you talk about some of the directions you've been pursuing since 2019?
I'd love to. So my work was always about Russia, and I was always interested in kind of bringing history of science in Russia and Russian history into history of science. I did this book on England just because it would allow me to get really, really into the kind of fine detail of material things very quickly in a way that would have been harder with Russian sources just because of the language and the sort of getting access to materials. But having done that now and having got sort of what I wanted with that, I'm now thinking, how do we think about thrift in other parts of the world? And what I would really like to do is some projects where I think maybe working with other people about equivalent kinds of practices in places like China or India, Africa, South America, Japan. Japan would be an amazing place to think about these things. And my own particular expertise lets me look at this in the case of Russia. So I'm doing a few projects on practices that link up with thrifty science in Russia. So there's one, for example, on a book called The Domostroy, which is a household management book from early modern Muscovite Russia. And it's normally read as a kind of social document talked about in terms of the kind of oppressive situation for women in early modern Russia. But actually, if you look at the book, it's full of discussions of material things. So household furnishings and plants and materials that you use for building, all sorts of things. So I'm looking at that, and it comes across as being very thrifty. You have a similar kind of concern to really make the most of materials that comes through in that. And I have another couple of more projects from different periods. One is on the 19th century on what I call voyages of maintenance. We talk a lot about voyages of discovery in the 18th, early 19th century, but the discovery bit is only, a very small percentage of the time on these voyages. And most of the time they're washing the decks and fixing the rigging. And so maintenance is actually incredibly important to them. I've done a paper on Russian ships and the Russian Navy and all the different things that they did to maintain the ships and all the infrastructure that they depended on to make that happen. It's kind of exploring the way that people made things endure in that period. So that's more of the material culture stuff. And that second thing that I'm looking at is I was thinking, well, what can I look at that's as far away from material culture as I can possibly get? And that led me to the work of a science fiction writer from the 1930s called Olaf Stapledon. And Stapledon is a fascinating character who wrote books which are as expansive in their scope as it's possible to imagine. Certainly, I've never come across anything more expansive. So instead of talking about sieves in the kitchen cupboard, his work is on the history of evolution of humans over several billion years. He manages to pack into novels that are kind of 200 pages long, 4, 5, 30 billion years of history. I am fascinated by the idea of thinking at that kind of scale. And I think it seems to me that that's as much of an interesting proposition as thinking at a much smaller, the kind of micro scale of material things. So I'm looking at Stapledon, who basically wrote what are now called science fiction novels. I don't really think they're science fiction at all, but that's what they're kind of labelled as. I'm looking at his work to think about him as a philosopher of science, because I think he had really interesting things to say about the world, which as historians and philosophers of science, we haven't really paid any attention to because they tend to be pigeonholed as science fiction and then not dealt with by people other than literary historians.
So what would be an example of the kind of question he's trying to engage that you think is worth identifying?
So he wrote a book called Last and First Men. One of the things he does is he says, let's just follow evolution over billions of years and see what happens. And he was very concerned that his story should be scientifically accurate. So he consulted with scientists of his time, people like Haldane in London. And then he kind of lets rip on what will happen to humans over these enormously long periods of time. And what you realise when you read it is that anything can happen. So in the end, evolution produces forms of life that are just as bizarre and outlandish as anything we could imagine from sort of religious or magical or fantasy texts. And the whole idea that there's a kind of scientific evolutionary story of life that's much more grounded in science and objectivity and reality than all the flights of fancy of religious thinking or mythology, that boundary starts to kind of come apart. And I find it fascinating that once you start thinking in those huge timescales, that division starts to really look fragile. And the kind of scope of it and the way that thinking on those very large timescales allows you to rethink things that you normally kind of take for granted, that's the thing I find fascinating about it. Everything is possible and nothing is grounded. And it's not just in the case of, knowledge, but the very biological being of the people who do the knowing is itself completely open to enormous variation. I mean, if one thinks about identity, for example, it's not just that, say, gender or race are altered or changeable in Stapledon, but every aspect of the physical being of humans is completely transformed, so that the current physical shape that we have is just a moment in a very, very long history of constant change. And I find that a very kind of liberating, interesting way of thinking that we don't normally pay attention to.
Are there questions out there that you'd like to point the best and the brightest students towards and say, if you get that one, you really have got an important contribution to the discipline?
Coming back to the Thrifty Science, I think it would be really a good idea to have a much more detailed knowledge of the kinds of domestic, practical ways that people understand the natural world and work with it, work with material things in their everyday lives, in history, in different parts of the world, because those all offer alternative ways of operating to the kind of models, the kind of Western capitalist models that we have clearly got us into complete catastrophe in the past couple of 100 years. And we don't have that knowledge. And I think it would be really good if we did. And I hope in the coming years that's something I want to try to figure out. And as I say, I think it would have to be a collaborative project, because no one person's going to have the means to appreciate that. So that's one thing.
We need to discover those fly-on-the-wall diarists across so many different cultures that somehow have managed to record what people are doing without an idea that something stands out as important. That would be the perfect treasure.
Well, this is where we come back to the art thing, because the aspect of this is that material things themselves are the diary. But because as academics, we tend to put the texts first, we tend to talk about the material things as being silent. And if only we had a text that would tell us what they say. And I think we have to work the other way around. The objects talk all the time, but we're not very good at listening to them. And the texts are a kind of poor reflection of the richness of the objects and the life around them. So I think one has to think about how to put the objects first and let them do the talking. And I guess if you're a painter or a sculptor, that's what you do. So I think there's also room, if we're going to have that understanding, that can really involve the objects themselves being the kind of primary sources. And of course, texts are essential, important, valuable for understanding them. But we also want to be at a point where we can say that an object is essential for understanding a text. I've been reading a lot of Svetlana Alexievich recently. She's a Belarusian journalist turned novelist, and she wrote the book on Chernobyl, which was the basis of the TV series on Chernobyl that came out recently. And she's an absolutely amazing writer, because what she does is she basically goes to people who were involved in very intense events, war and disasters and things like that, and she basically says to them, "Tell me how it made you feel." And so her books are almost devoid of the historical facts of the episodes that she's talking about, so the Afghan war or the Chernobyl disaster. But what they do is they document in enormous detail the way that people experience those events. And I think one could take a similar kind of approach to material things and try to recapture how they have made people feel and how they resonate in the contemporary world through their historical kind of trajectories, so that you don't need the diary with the facts in order to make sense of them. And actually, there's a different way to do it, which kind of taps into people's experience of them more directly. We did a project a few years ago with the Institute of Making in UCL, which was about the emotions and material culture. And it was a fascinating project. There's still a website. There's a blog somewhere online about it. But it did got me thinking about that. So that's something I haven't really kind of fully explored, but I'd like to definitely do that more in the future.
Let me ask you one more question. Now, you're an avid collector. Tell me about some of your recent finds.
One of the things that I bought recently was a printing plate for an advertisement which appeared in a comic in the 1950s. There's a rectangle made of metal, and it's about maybe 20 centimetres by 10 centimetres. So it's a little tiny thing. And I bought it in an auction online, and it turned up at Christmas time this year. And then it just sort of opened up this whole world of questions about what this thing is and how is it used and where does it come from. I knew it was from about 1940, so I bought online for £2 a used book, which was a textbook on how to do printing, like industrial printing from 1945. It's incredibly dry reading, but it does tell you how it all worked. And it was very, very interesting because it allowed me to kind of figure out what this thing was and how it was used. And it also made me realize that all these gigantic printing machines from the 1940s now exist on my desktop in a miniaturized version in my desktop printer. So I love it when you get little things like that, a bit like sieves I was saying earlier. It opens up a kind of whole world of material things and practices and knowledge that you just had no idea about. There's lots of things. I could go on ad infinitum about these sorts of things, but that was one that stood out recently.
Simon, thanks very much for taking the time to have a conversation today and for talking about thrifty science and so many other things. I can't wait for us to all get back into the department together so that we can have a cup of tea and a chat. So thanks very much for today.
Thank you very much, Joe. And I look forward to having a nice hot cup of tea in the near future, hopefully.
Right. Bye now.
Bye-bye.
Well, that's our show for today. If you're like me, you're looking around the space right now, wondering what's been reused, recycled, and repurposed. It's amazing how much fits into these groups. Thanks to Simon for taking the time to chat. We'll have him back sometime soon talking about his older work on fireworks or his newer work on science in Russia. Before we end today, let me do a bit of housekeeping. I want to remind you that our podcast has 3 types of episodes: regular episodes, bonus episodes, and careers episodes. The regular episodes are mostly interviews with people in STS about the work they do and how that might be interesting to you. We also have bonus episodes. These can be talks arising from our research, projects from our students, or just special pieces about us that we want you to hear. We add into the bonus episodes advice from our admissions tutors who talk about our degree programs and how to apply. Add to the regular and bonus episodes our series on careers. These showcase alumni from our degrees, former students who've now graduated and gone on to do lots of things. And we think you'll find their stories brilliant. So that's regular episodes, bonus episodes, and career episodes. That makes We Are STS quite a big show. Music today was Rollin' at 5 by Kevin MacLeod. It's available from the website filmmusic.io. We Are STS is a production of the Department of Science and Technology Studies at University College London. Finally, you can find out more about the show, tell us what you think, and explore our programs just by visiting our website. Here's the address, so write it down. It's ucl.ac.uk/STS/podcast. That's it for today. We'll meet here again soon. Till then, everybody, I'm Professor Joe Kane. Thanks for listening. You've been listening to We Are STS, a podcast from the Department of Science and Technology Studies at University College London. Follow us online at ucl.ac.uk/STS/podcast.